Someone called a chess club and left a message for a man named Wallace. The caller gave a name, Qualtro, that no one had ever heard. He left an address 25 Menlove Gardens East that did not exist, and he asked that Wallace come to that address the following evening at 7:30 to discuss an insurance policy. Wallace received the message when he arrived at the club 20 minutes later, wrote the address in his notebook, and thought nothing strange about it. He was an insurance agent. People called about policies. He would go. The next evening he went. He took a tram across Liverpool to the Menlove Gardens area, and for the better part of an hour he searched for the address that did not exist. Menlove Gardens North was there. South was there. West was there. East was not. And here is a detail that cuts both ways, and has driven people mad for 90 years. During that search, Wallace stopped and asked for directions multiple times. A newsagent, a police constable, several strangers on the street. He made himself visible. If he was innocent, he was simply lost. If he was guilty, he was building an alibi in real time, making sure witnesses would remember him looking for an address at the exact hour his wife was being killed. Both readings fit. Neither can be ruled out. He gave up and went home around 8:45. The front door, he said, was bolted from the inside. He could not get in. He went to the back, found the back door open, and entered. His wife, Julia, was lying on the parlor floor, beaten to death. The room was dim. A single gas lamp was lit, turned low. A mackintosh, a raincoat belonging to Wallace, was tucked under her body, partially burned. That mackintosh is another piece of evidence that has never been satisfactorily explained by either side. There is also a witness, a milk delivery boy named Alan Close, who told police he had seen Julia alive at the front door that evening, accepting the milk. Close's account placed her alive as late as 6:30, possibly 6:45. If that timing is right, it narrows the window for the murder to an almost impossibly tight margin for Wallace, who would have needed to kill Julia clean himself of blood-changed clothes and leave the house in time to catch his tram. Almost impossible, but not quite. The case lives in that gap between almost and not quite, and it has lived there for nearly a century. Hold on to that phone call, because everything in this case, the arrest, the trial, the conviction, the reversal, and 90 years of argument turns on a single question: who made it? If Wallace made the call himself, then the whole evening was an invention, a manufactured alibi, elaborate and premeditated design to place him miles from home, at the hour his wife was killed. The phone box the call was traced to was 400 yards from his house, close to the tram stop he would have used to get to the chess club. He could have placed the call, walked to the tram, and arrived at the club 20 minutes later. The timing works. It is tight, but it works. If someone else made the call, then that person knew Wallace's name, knew he was a member of the chess club, knew roughly when the club met, and understood that a message about insurance business would be plausible enough to send him across the city on a January evening, leaving Julia alone in the house for someone to kill her. That person would need to know Wallace's world well enough to construct a trap inside it. 2 doors. The case has been frozen between them since 1931. William Herbert Wallace was 52, thin, quiet. A reader of philosophy and a player of chess, described by almost everyone who knew him as emotionally reserved to the point of opacity. He was an insurance agent for the Prudential, collecting small premiums door to door in the working class neighborhoods of Anfield. Julia was his wife of nearly 20 years, a former music teacher, private and gentle. By every account available, the marriage was affectionate but subdued. Two solitary people who had made a life together in a small terraced house on Wolverton Street. I should be clear about what the police decided because it shaped everything. They decided Wallace did it. They decided the Qualtrough call was his own construction, that he had killed Julia in the narrow window between the call and his departure for the fake address, cleaned himself up, and left. He was arrested, tried at the Liverpool Assizes, and convicted of murder. He was sentenced to death. And here I need to be honest about something that has biased every telling of this case, including possibly this one. Wallace's behavior after finding Julia's body was strange. He was calm. He was methodical. He called the police, let them in, and spoke to them with a composure that unnerved every officer in the room. At the trial, this composure was used against him. What kind of man finds his wife bludgeoned to death and does not fall apart? But I have covered enough cases to know that people in shock do not behave the way we expect them to, and the gap between how a person should react and how they do react is not evidence of anything except the gap itself. Wallace was a man who read philosophy and practiced emotional restraint as a discipline. That his grief did not perform the way a jury wanted it to does not make him a killer. It also does not make him innocent. It makes him unknowable. And that unknowability is the soil this whole case grows in. There is also the Mackintosh Wallace's own raincoat found bundled under Julia's body, partially burned. Nobody has ever explained it satisfactorily. If Wallace killed her, why was his own coat there? Did he wear it as a covering to avoid blood? Then burn it, but fail to finish. If someone else killed her, why use Wallace's coat at all? The Mackintosh sits in the evidence like a sentence in a language nobody speaks. It means something. No one has ever been able to say what, and then something happened that had never happened before in English legal history. The Court of Criminal Appeal overturned a murder conviction, not on a technicality, but on the grounds that the verdict was not supported by the evidence. The judges reviewed the case and concluded in language that was unusually blunt that the evidence against Wallace did not sustain the conviction. He was freed. He returned to Liverpool. He died 2 years later of kidney disease. A man who had been convicted and unconvicted of killing his wife with no answer behind him and no peace ahead. And here is the second door and the name behind it, Richard Gordon Parry. A young man, 22 at the time, who had worked with Wallace at the Prudential and knew his schedule, his routes, his habits. Parry knew Wallace attended the chess club. Parry knew what a call about insurance business would sound like. And the phone box the Qualtrough call was made from 400 yards from Wallace's house was also near Parry's own home. I should be as careful with Parry as I have been with every unnamed suspect in this series. He was questioned by police, provided an alibi that was partially corroborated, and was never charged. Years later, in a conversation reportedly overheard by a third party, Parry allegedly made statements that could be interpreted as knowledge of the crime, but reportedly and could be interpreted are not evidence, and I will not treat them as such. Parry died in 1980 without ever being formally investigated for the murder. And I want to be honest about my own instinct here, because being honest about that is part of doing this properly. It is very tempting to want Parry to be the answer. It resolves the case cleanly. It exonerates the man who was wrongfully convicted, and it gives you the satisfying shape of a true crime story, the real killer hiding in plain sight while the wrong man goes to prison. I noticed that instinct in myself, and I am telling you about it so that you can notice it too. Because wanting an answer is not the same as having one, and the whole point of this case is that the evidence does not let you have one. Not honestly, and this is the mechanism I want you to see, because it is different from every case I have covered before. The problem in this case is not that there were no suspects. The problem is that there were two, and the evidence for each was exactly strong enough to prevent the other from ever being resolved. If you believe Wallace did it, the Qualtrough call becomes a work of dark ingenuity. If you believe Parry did it, the Qualtrough call becomes the key to a conspiracy that was never unwound. Both readings use the same evidence. Both are internally coherent. And because neither can be disproven, the case sits exactly where it has sat for 90 years, on a hinge balanced between two doors, unable to swing either way. The investigation did not fail because of incompetence or corruption. It failed because the evidence genuinely pointed in two directions with almost equal force. And the system, the courts, the police, the appeals process was built to handle cases with one answer, not two. When the conviction was overturned, nobody opened the second door. Nobody investigated Parry with the seriousness the case demanded. The machinery of justice had spent its energy convicting the wrong man or the right man, depending on which door you believe, and when that conviction fell apart, there was nothing left. Julia Wallace was beaten to death in her own parlor on a January evening, while her husband was across the city looking for an address that did not exist. Someone made a phone call the night before. That set the whole thing in motion. That call is the single most important piece of evidence in the case, and it points in two directions at once. And 90 years later, no one has ever determined which direction is true. The truth split in half. Both halves collapsed. And Julia is still lying on the parlor floor, waiting for an answer that is never going to come. It would be natural to hear that and think, well, that is a rare problem. Two equally strong suspects, two equally coherent theories. How often does that happen? The answer is more often than you think. But the next case does something worse. It gives you a suspect so overwhelming, so obvious, so loudly indicated by every piece of circumstantial evidence available that an entire nation was convinced of her guilt, and then it acquits her, and the acquittal seals the case shut so completely that the other doors in the house are never opened at all. The day before her father and stepmother were hacked to death in their own house, Lizzie Borden walked into a pharmacy in Fall River, Massachusetts, and tried to buy prussic acid. She said she needed it to clean a sealskin cape. The pharmacist refused. Prussic acid is hydrogen cyanide, and it required a prescription. Lizzie left without it. The jury that tried her for murder the following year never heard about the prussic acid. The judge ruled it inadmissible prejudicial rather than probative, he said, since the victims were killed with a hatchet, not poison, And so the single most suggestive piece of evidence about what Lizzie Borden may have been planning the day before the murders was removed from the case before the people deciding her fate could weigh it. Hold on to that, because the gap between what the jury saw and what was actually there is one of the widest in American criminal history. Andrew Borden was 70, a wealthy and deeply frugal man in a city where his fortune built on property banking and undertaking made him prominent, and his parsimony made him disliked. He lived with his second wife, Abby, 64, his daughter Lizzie, 32, and a maid named Bridget Sullivan in a house on 2nd Street that was, by the standards of his wealth, remarkably modest. No indoor plumbing upstairs, no hallways, rooms that opened directly into one another. The family was, by every account, unhappy. Lizzie and her older sister Emma resented Abby, their stepmother. There had been a property dispute. Andrew had transferred a piece of real estate to Abby's family, and his daughters saw it as a theft of their inheritance. The house was thick with silence and grievance. On the morning of August 4th, someone entered the downstairs sitting room where Andrew Borden was napping on the sofa and struck him in the face with a hatchet, 10 or 11 blows delivered with enough force to split his skull. Upstairs in the guest room, Abby had already been killed, the same way, 18 or 19 blows to the back of her head, while she was on her hands and knees, apparently making the bed. The medical evidence suggested Abby died at least an hour, possibly 90 minutes before Andrew. That gap is everything. If Abby was killed first, then someone was in the house with her body for over an hour before killing Andrew, moving through the rooms, waiting while Lizzie and Bridget Sullivan were both present in the home. Bridget was washing windows outside. Lizzie told police she had been in the barn, then in the backyard, then in the kitchen. Her account shifted. But someone during that hour was in a small house with a dead woman upstairs and gave no alarm. Lizzie was arrested, tried, and in a verdict that shocked much of the country, acquitted. The jury was all male, as the law required. Many historians have noted that the social assumptions of the era worked powerfully in Lizzie's favor. A well-bred woman of the upper middle class simply could not, in the imagination of 12 Victorian gentlemen, have done something so physically savage. The prosecution's case was entirely circumstantial. There was no murder weapon conclusively identified. A handleless hatchet head was found in the basement. But its connection to the crime was contested, and its blade appeared to have been recently cleaned or broken. There was no blood on Lizzie's clothing, which the prosecution struggled to explain. A hatchet murder of this savagery should have left the killer soaked. And then there is the dress. 3 days after the murders, a neighbor saw Lizzie standing at the kitchen stove burning a dress. When asked about it, Lizzie said it had been stained with paint. The neighbor, Alice Russell, a friend, would later testify about the burning, and it became one of the most debated moments of the trial. Was it the dress Lizzie wore during the murders destroyed before it could be tested? Or was it, as Lizzie said, an old house dress ruined by a painting project? The jury heard this and was not persuaded. The public heard it and never stopped being persuaded. I owe you the fairness I owe every suspect in this series, and in Lizzie's case, fairness cuts in both directions. The circumstantial case against her is heavy. She was in the house. She had motive. She had opportunity. She lied about her movements. She burned a dress, and she tried to buy poison the day before. but heavy is not proven, and a jury denied the prussic acid evidence, working within the social assumptions of its time, found her not guilty. That verdict is the law, and it stands. But here is what the verdict also did, and it is a reason I brought you this case. It closed every other door in the house, because all the energy, all the investigation, all the public attention had been focused so completely on Lizzie that when she was acquitted, there was nothing left. Nobody had seriously investigated anyone else, not because there were no other possibilities, but because Lizzie was so overwhelming a suspect that looking anywhere else felt absurd. And there were other possibilities. The Uncle John Morse, Andrew's brother-in-law, had been staying in the house and had been present that morning. He left before the murders and returned after, and his alibi was suspiciously detailed. He recited it with a precision that struck several observers as rehearsed. He had financial entanglements with Andrew. He was never seriously investigated. And then there is Bridget Sullivan, the maid, the only other person definitively in the house. Bridget testified for the prosecution, gave her account, and then did something that should make you pause. She left Fall River after the trial and never spoke about the case again for the rest of her life. Not to journalists, not to authors, not to anyone. She carried whatever she knew or whatever she saw into a silence that lasted decades, and she never broke it. That silence is not evidence, but it is a door, and nobody ever opened it. Lizzie Borden lived in Fall River for the remaining 34 years of her life, largely ostracized, wealthy from her inheritance, and forever shadowed by a children's rhyme that convicted her more thoroughly than any jury could. She died in 1927. The case has never been solved. And the reason it has never been solved is not that the evidence was insufficient. It is that the evidence pointed so powerfully at one person that when that person was acquitted, the investigation had nowhere to go. Every other door had been left shut, and by the time anyone thought to try them, the hinges had rusted closed. Johnson here, quick pause before the last one, because this one is the biggest and the strangest of the three. If you're still here, this is the kind of case you came for. Subscribe, and the bell, they keep these coming. Now, let me take you into the last case. In Liverpool, two suspects split the evidence in half, and neither could be proven. In Fall River, one suspect consumed all the oxygen, and when she was acquitted, there was none left for anyone else. Both times the split was between people, two names, two theories, two sets of circumstantial evidence pulling in opposite directions. The last case does something different and worse. It splits not between suspects, but between entire investigations, different prosecutors, different theories, different decades, each one consuming the resources and credibility of the others until the case is not unsolved so much as devoured from the inside. One gun, the same .22 caliber. Beretta firing the same rare Winchester series H ammunition, turning up at crime scene after crime scene across 17 years and 8 double murders in the hills outside Florence. 16 people shot dead in parked cars on lovers' lanes in the Tuscan countryside, and every single killing linked by ballistics to the same weapon. The gun was the one thread that connected everything. And the case was destroyed because nobody could agree on who was holding it. It begins, as these things often do, with a crime that looked solved. In August of 1968, a woman named Barbara Locci and her lover Antonio Lobianco were found shot dead in a parked car outside Florence. Loci's 6-year-old son was asleep in the back seat. The boy survived. Loci's husband Stefano Mele confessed and was convicted. Case closed. A domestic murder. A jealous husband. A wife with a lover. The oldest story in the criminal file. And then 6 years later, the gun came back. A couple shot dead in a parked car in 1974. Same Beretta. Same ammunition. Mele was in prison. He could not have done it. The gun was still out there, and someone else was using it. Over the next 11 years, from 1974 to 1985, 6 more double murders followed, all with the same terrifying pattern. Couples in parked cars on country roads, shot through the windows. In the dark, the woman's body mutilated afterward. In several cases, parts of the body were removed entirely and never recovered. Florence was paralyzed with fear. Young couples stopped going to the countryside. Lovers' lanes emptied. The Italian press gave the killer a name, Il Mostro di Firenze, the monster of Florence. The killings had a cruelty that went beyond murder. Whoever did this did not simply shoot and leave. He stayed with the bodies in the dark and performed acts of mutilation that the police withheld from the public for years. And after the last known killing in 1985, a piece of the victim's body was mailed to the lead prosecutor's office in Florence in a plain envelope with no fingerprints, no usable forensic trace. It was a message. The monster was not merely killing. He was communicating directly with the system that was trying to find him, and the system could not read what he was saying. The investigation, which should have narrowed with each killing same gun, same ammunition, same method, a trail of ballistic evidence that grew longer every year, instead flew apart into competing theories that spent decades consuming each other. The first piece was the Sardinian Trail. The reasoning was straightforward. The gun came from the 1968 murder. Mele was Sardinian, his wife had lovers within the Sardinian immigrant community, so the gun must have stayed within that circle. Investigators spent years pursuing Mele's relatives and associates, Francesco Vinci, Salvatore Vinci, a web of grudges and affairs, and Sardinian clan loyalties. Men were arrested, men were released, and then more couples were murdered while the Sardinian suspects sat in jail and the trail collapsed. 6 years of work gone. And here I have to say something in defense of the investigators who pursued it, because being honest about failure includes being honest about why reasonable people fail. The Sardinian Trail was not a bad theory. It was a logical theory. The gun came from a specific crime, and tracing the gun through the social network surrounding that crime is exactly what competent police work looks like. The problem was not the logic. The problem was that the logic became a commitment, and the commitment became an identity. And by the time the theory collapsed, the investigators had spent so long inside it that they could not see the case from outside it anymore. That is not stupidity. That is human nature under institutional pressure, and it will happen again in this very case with different names and a different theory, and the result will be the same. The second piece came from a new direction entirely. Pietro Pacciani, a farmer with a violent history, including a prior conviction for killing a man he found with his fiancée and for sexual assault. Pacciani was convicted of 7 of the double murders in 1994. The conviction was dramatic, emotional, and contested from the start. It rested heavily on circumstantial evidence and behavioral profiling rather than forensics. And then the appeals court overturned it in 1996, finding the evidence insufficient. Pacciani died in 1998 before a retrial could take place under circumstances that were themselves disputed. But the investigation had already spawned a third piece. Two men, Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lati, were identified as Pacciani's compagni di merende, his picnic companions. Lati confessed. Vanni and Lati were convicted as accomplices in 1998. Lati's confession, however, was riddled with inconsistencies and no forensic evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints placed either man at any of the crime scenes. Both died in prison. And in 2024, DNA analysis on bullets recovered from multiple crime scenes found male genetic material that matched none of the convicted men. None of them. I need to stop here and tell you what that means, because the full weight of it is easy to miss. The Italian justice system convicted 3 men for these murders. All 3 are dead, and the DNA on the bullets, the actual physical evidence from the actual crime scenes, does not match any of them. That does not prove they were innocent, but it means that someone else's hands were on that gun, and the investigation that was supposed to find those hands spent decades looking somewhere else. And I owe you this caveat because I have spent this whole series telling you to be careful with certainty, and I will not abandon that now when the DNA result happens to be dramatic. It is possible that Pacciani or his companions were involved in some capacity as lookouts, as accessories, as participants in something adjacent to the murders, even if their DNA is not on the bullets. The DNA tells you whose hands loaded the gun. It does not tell you the complete story of who was in those hills on those nights. I am not asking you to conclude that every convicted man was innocent. I am asking you to notice that the physical evidence and the judicial outcome do not match, and that the investigation never paused long enough to reconcile them, because by the time the DNA arrived, the investigation had already moved on to its next theory, and the next, and the next. And it got worse. A prosecutor named Michel Giuttari pursued a theory that the murders were connected to a satanic cult, that Pacciani and his companions were hired hands working for wealthy and powerful figures who wanted the body parts removed from the victims for use in occult rituals. The theory had no physical evidence behind it. It had no confessions that corroborated it. What it had was a prosecutor with absolute conviction and the institutional power to pursue anyone who disagreed with him. An Italian journalist named Mario Spezzi, who had covered the case from the very first murders and knew it more intimately than almost anyone alive, publicly challenged Giuttari's theory and advanced his own, pointing toward a different suspect entirely. Giuttari's response was not to engage the argument. It was to have Spezzi arrested and charged with obstruction and complicity. An American author named Douglas Preston, who had been collaborating with Spezzi on a book about the case, was summoned for interrogation, accused of planting evidence, and effectively forced to leave Italy. The investigation had stopped hunting the monster. It was hunting the people who disagreed with the investigator. I need to be straight about why I am telling you this, because it is not a digression. It is the mechanism in its purest form. When an investigation divides, the division does not stay polite. It becomes territorial. Each faction defends not the truth, but its theory of the truth, and anyone who threatens the theory journalist, author, rival investigator becomes an enemy to be neutralized. The case stops being about the dead. It becomes about the living and their careers and their pride and who gets to claim the answer. And this is the mechanism. Not silence, not certainty, not invisibility, division. The case did not fail because there was no evidence the gun alone was a thread that ran through 17 years and should have led somewhere. It failed because every time a new investigator, a new prosecutor, a new theory took the stage, it did not build on what came before it replaced it. The Sardinian Trail was abandoned for Pacciani. Pacciani was abandoned for the Picnic Companions. The Picnic Companions were folded into a satanic conspiracy. Each theory consumed resources, years, careers, and credibility, and when it collapsed, it took the accumulated knowledge of the previous investigations down with it. The case was not unsolved. It was spent, exhausted from the inside by investigators who were so committed to their own answers that they could not hear anyone else's. The gun has never been found. The DNA on the bullets does not match any convicted suspect. 16 people are dead. The monster of Florence, whoever held that Beretta across 17 years of Tuscan evenings, has never been identified with certainty. And a 6-year-old boy who was asleep in the back seat of a car in 1968, who woke up to find his mother dead, is now in his 60s, and the case that began with his mother's murder is no closer to resolution than it was the night he opened his eyes. A parlor in Liverpool, a house in Fall River, the hills outside Florence. 3 murders, 3 countries, 3 eras, and in each one the truth did not disappear. It split. It divided into 2 or more versions of itself, each with its own logic, each with its own evidence, each pulling the investigation in a different direction with enough force to prevent the other from ever being resolved. In Liverpool, 2 suspects balanced the case on a knife edge, and the blade never tipped. In Fall River, one suspect was so overwhelming that when she was acquitted, every other door in the house had already rusted shut. In Florence, the investigation fractured into so many competing theories that it spent more energy fighting itself than fighting the killer. We want to believe that evidence converges, that the more you gather, the closer you get, the clearer the picture becomes. These 3 cases say something harder. Sometimes evidence diverges. Sometimes it points in 2 directions, or 3 or 5, and the investigation does not have the resources or the will or the institutional design to follow all of them honestly at once. When that happens, the truth does not hide. It falls through the gap between the 2 halves of itself, and it stays there. Julia Wallace, Andrew and Abby Borden, 16 people in the Tuscan Hills, whose names I have not had the time to give you, but who deserve them. They are all still waiting on the other side of a door that nobody can agree on how to open. I'm Johnson. Thank you for sitting with the hard ones. I'll see you on the next